The topic today is sustainable travel. And I think everyone's aware that over the last century, our roads and our cities have become totally dominated by the car. People walk and cycle less, take buses and trains less. The car has actually become more than a mode of transport, but it's also a status symbol. I don't know if you heard an interview with Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, but he said that he fell into that trap of it, his car being a status symbol, driving to work in his big Range Rover across London. And it's only sort of in the recent years where he sort of realised the importance of sustainable travel. It can also be a way of carrying belongings around and even somewhere to sleep. But our cities have become designed for the car, and people are often sort of a secondary thought. But we all know that carbon emissions from the transport sector make up a really big proportion of the total emissions. And the IPCC says providing short distance, low carbon urban infrastructures, which is a terrible phrase, basically just means buses and bikes and walking routes, could be one of the most impactful actions we take to reduce our footprint. There's also, of course, health benefits of more active travel, like from walking and cycling. The physical activity makes our bodies and our minds better. The air pollution and congestion and heat from vehicles is less. But I think everyone that is here today is probably grappling with this behavioural challenge of getting people out of their cars and onto bikes, buses, trams, foot. And I've discovered it's a very tricky one. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Christina, who's our first speaker. Christina is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Copenhagen, and her big focus is behavioural economics. I first met her when she presented her work on nudging charity donations, where she found that emailing reminders to people to donate actually backfired and led people to unsubscribe from the charity's communications. Hands up who's ever done that. They're just so fed up with the constant reminders, they turn them off. But since then, her focus has narrowed to environmental decision-making and policy design. Beyond the university walls, she's also co-founded Impactually, which is a behavioural science consultancy advising policymakers and organisations on behavioural insights for sustainable transitions. And her research looks at the behavioural barriers to sustainable choices, like the adoption of energy efficient technologies and the intention action gap in transport or in food and food waste decisions. And I think I mentioned to those joining, she's a very clear role model. She told me once that she took the bus to hospital while in labour with her first child and back home with her newborn. And not for financial reasons, she says, but because it was simply the most convenient option. So just a little round of applause for her there. I think it's fair to say that she puts considerable energy into running a lot of large-scale field experiments, which, as anyone who's tried to do one, is pretty tough. One example is that she explored the impact of 2-to-1 offers in supermarkets, where she and her team put on 21,000 stickers onto vegetables to invite consumers to participate in her survey. So that is pure dedication. But it's another large-scale field trial that she's going to talk to us about today, entitled Nudges Aren't Enough to Change Travel Habits. And I'm going to hand over to her there.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. That was such a nice introduction. And yes, indeed, I live very much close to the hospital, so we didn't have to go super far. But indeed, it was actually nicer than to take the taxi. So we took the bus there and back. But today I want to talk, a little bit more about taking buses. But before we get into that, I thought also for the discussion later, it could be nice to think a little bit about more in general, why don't people change their habits, right? And then we can zoom in and saying, okay, what are particular reasons why the nudges could make sense if we want to address that particular barrier. So I think that we definitely have to acknowledge that there is one group, and these are people who just don't want to. Like we said, you said the car is a status symbol, or they like it, or they live in such a rural area, although that has to do with infrastructure as well, but they just don't want to. And I think if you think about the US, there's certain areas where taking buses is also extremely uncomfortable, or taking public transport in general. There's electricity outages, and then you're stuck in a metro in the middle of New York in a subway. So there might be reasons why people just don't want it. So that's one reason, but also there we would have to acknowledge that nudging is not going to change their opinion. And then we might have the next, the next group, and this could be an information failure, right? So maybe people don't know that the bus is actually faster, or that there's a good bike lane and that it's actually quite feasible, or that they can shower at work, and that way if they do bike to work, they can get a shower there, change their clothes, they could get a locker there. So there might be some type of informational frictions that we could resolve just by telling people that this is actually possible, or they can rent an e-bike and see how they like it, and then they can move on. So that would be more of an information. So these people might want to, but they have this lack of information, which we could resolve by giving information. But then we might have another group who doesn't have the means, right? So maybe they cannot afford to get an electric bike, or they, for some other reason, they can't afford the public transport ticket, although that's hard to, they can afford the bike, the car, so maybe that's not the best argument here. But you could also think about not having the means, that maybe there is no good bike pass. We heard somebody was in Berlin, and I heard a lot of complaints from there that part of the way there's a bike pass, but then again, there's some areas which don't have a bike pass, so it's just too dangerous to drive there, especially with kids. So that could also be an infrastructure problem, or in a way means not your personal finances, but something about how the environment is set up. So that would mean that we would have to change either the incentives or change something about the infrastructure of the environment, which could then help people do a particular behavior more. And then lastly, we have the category that we usually think about when we think about how could nudging affect this, or more about behavioral science reasons. So these are all the people I would classify as, I want to, but there's maybe something that was in the way. So maybe we've heard it a little bit, at least from some of you in the chat now, is that, well, I feel bad for taking the car. And yes, I think Liz said usually during the school year, she does walk or take the bike to school, but now because it's vacation, somehow I took the car. And so I don't know if anything else changed about the situation. Buses are maybe not running, but I think that would be the group, right, where we think something like behavioral science or nudging could be relevant, where people have these good intentions, but somehow they get off track when it comes down to it. But there's nothing truly in the way that would stop them from doing this behavior. So this is really what we usually think about, this intention to action gap, right? So nudging can be effective if we assume people have the correct information. So they know there's buses and how these buses go, and they can look them up. They have access to this necessary technology, tools, budget, so they can afford it. The infrastructure is in place. The buses go at a reasonable time, that they can actually make it to work. So all these surrounding factors are given. And then also they state the right intentions when asked. So saying, well, generally, I do want to take more public transport or walk or bike, but somehow something gets in the way and we don't observe this expected outcome. So I think also here, again, reiterating, if people don't want to do this, we can try to convince them. We can try to design policies such as pollution restrictions, something. We can reduce the amount of parking spaces in our cities. We can turn streets into one-way lanes. So those might be ways, even if people don't want to normally, to get them to change travel mode. But nudging is not going to be the right approach, because if you don't want to, then there's no intention action gap to close. I think this is good to keep in mind for everything that we talk about, is like, what type of group of people are we potentially trying to influence, and then also to get an understanding of how large could this group of people be who are in this last category of I want to, but, and how could we then design interventions that get them to change. So what I now want to talk to you about in the second part of this presentation is a large field trial we did in Skåne. This is the southern region of Sweden. Fairly large. It's I think 2 million inhabitants in the area, and these are both larger cities such as Malmö, but then also a lot of rural areas. But it's a good mix between cities and also rural areas where we can look at this public transport. It's a very good public transport setting. So they have a lot of, you see the bus here, it's very nice buses, there's trams, there's regional trains, it's fairly well connected, it's relatively low cost compared to other countries, but not cheap. in comparison, but it is definitely something that is possible to take. It is a nice, there's no stigma within Sweden that public transport is for poor people as it might be in the US. So I think here we have a good situation where we might say, okay, the infrastructure requirements are given so that many people could be taking public transport if they wanted to. We worked directly with the public transport agency in Skåne, so they were also interested in getting more people to take public transport. So our incentives were very much aligned to collaborate. And the nice thing is what they already do is that when people move to the area or when they move within the area, they receive, and as you see here on the right side, they receive such a card which says, well, welcome to the area. You just moved here. If you want, you can get a 2-week free travel card, which is this yo-yo card, and you can enter this code here, go to website, and then you can receive this card and you can travel for free for 2 weeks. So that's the default. That's what they were always sending to people who newly moved to the area. And this is what we're using as a starting point for our experiment to see whether adding nudges to this and also increasing the incentives can affect travel habits. So what we did is that we, in addition to these 2-week free travel cards, we added a social norm nudge, which we know that has worked well in other situations, such as reducing electricity use or paying your taxes. And what we wrote is that in general, 72% of us people here who live in Skåne travel by public transport, at least occasionally. So as you know, if you're familiar with nudging, we cannot lie to people when it comes to these social norms. So we got some statistics and then we found out that this was, not everybody. If you only look at commuters, this is a lower number, it's around 20%. But if you think about people who at least a couple of times per month take public transport, you get to 72%. So that's the norm we use, and we added that to the card. The other group, they, for those, we actually doubled the time that they could take public transport. So I know that the statistic takes 30 days to build a habit. That's not true. It's not scientifically validated, but there is some argument to be made that if you have a bit more time to actually try out a particular new behavior, then this potentially could increase the behavior also in the long run. So that's what we wanted to measure. So if we double this time, whether it's going to lead to a longer behavior change. Now what we did is that we collected 15,000 addresses. So this is from everybody who moved within or to Skåne within a 1-month period. And then we randomly assigned them to the 3 conditions, around 5,000 people in each group. And then we measured how many people who received each of these letters ordered this free public transport card, activated it, so actually used it at least once during the trial period, and then also whether they used these cards still 6 months later. And here we wanted to understand, okay, yes, maybe you're going to use this free travel card when you get it and the travel is for free, but is that going to have long-term effects on travel behavior? We find that the social norm nudge had no effect on any of these outcomes. So this is the first group and the last group. We see that there's in both cases around 40% of people who order these cards, and then within that group, around 80% of them who also activate them, and a very small amount who still use these cards 6 months later. But we find that the economic incentive, so doubling the trial period, this had a statistically significant effect on ordering more cards and then also using them later on and even 6 months later. So what we learned from this is that people are willing to actually change their travel habits if they are incentivized and even in the long run. So here we want to see, okay, how do they use this in the long run? And of course, you see that there's been a big drop in usage after it's not for free anymore. But we see that there's still a significant higher amount of people who use the travel card even later. This period here, at least the amount of people, this was in summer vacation when they had very cheap summer cards. So that's, made sense to buy a different card and then continue again traveling. But even after the summer break, people were more likely to take it. And we see that this is actually some habit building because the people who were in the first or second week only occasionally using this card then increase their usage and they also use it more. Well, of course, there are some people who would have anyway bought a public transport card and they start using it from the beginning and they also continue using it. So that's part of the effect is from people who would anyway take public transport, but part of the effect is from people who are now using it more than before. So to conclude, I just want to say that nudging is only the right tool when we can identify this intention-action gap and when there's no structural obstacles to actually doing this behavior. There is a bus, you can afford to take the bus, you know what the time schedule is, or we can look it up. Social norms, as we find in our study, don't seem to matter much for public transport use. Just because other people are doing it does not have a direct effect on more people using public transport. But it is possible to change travel habits through incentives. So it does seem to be some evidence of that. Maybe some people perceive it to be too expensive to take public transport here. And yeah, that's something what we should take into consideration when we design these nudges. That's not impossible to do it, but I think the problem was very many times when we think about nudging, changing travel habits, we first need to make sure that all the infrastructure and means are in place, and then we can think about nudging, not trying to nudge in a way to overcome other types of more structural problems. All right, that was it from me, and then I'll look forward to the other presentations and later the discussion.